I thought about how to contribute to a conference that it is going to focus on the political phenomenon in transition, challenges to democracy and the state and societies. And I think that already in the title of this conference there is a particular attention to change, to transformations, to a particular moment that has been defined as a moment of backlash, of great recession and great regression, of crisis. And my reflections wants to depart and build upon social movement studies, but also address more generally the questions of how the social sciences themselves are challenged when from stable times in which changes happen gradually and incrementally, in which events are structured by long-lasting processes, in which people act on the basis of strategic habitus, we shift into periods in which all these constraints seems not to happen. Existing institutions seems in need of deep changes, and these changes happen very often in a dramatic, fast, and unpredictable ways. So I think that social movement studies could contribute to these reflections because it has always focused on how challenges happen to existing institutions, but that they also need to update their toolkit of concepts and theories in order to adapt them to times that are not the same as the times in which these disciplines tended to develop. So there is an empirical and a theoretical challenge for the political and the social sciences that follow on the challenges to the society, democracy, and the political system this conference is concerned with. Given the fact that social movement studies have built upon a toolkit of concepts and theories that had addressed stable times, looking at how political opportunities, resources, existing resonant frames tend to explain collective actions. I think the updating here needs to be done, especially in developing theoretical frames that could address movements that happens in situations in which political opportunities close down, resources are reduced, and frames, consensual frames no longer exist, cultural norms are contested. What does it mean in terms of social movement studies, and what does it mean in terms of understanding the times we are living in? So I want to start the reflections by looking at some very recent events that happened after several waves of contestations that since the beginning of the millenniums had characterized our societies. The global justice movements at the turn of the millennium, we had the anniversary of the Seattle's protest a few days ago, the anti-austerity protests that were particularly strong in Southern Europe and in Greece and in Spain in 2011, and now what seems to be a new wave of protests. So it is a moment that is characterized by the perceptions that what was institutionalized no longer work, and that deep changes, fast changes, that dramatic changes are necessary. 2019 is also the 50th anniversary of what was called, in particular in Italy, the hot autumn of 1969, which was also a moment in which protests spread quite quickly, addressing especially, but not only, the big factories, involving student protests and mobilizations and sometimes encounters between workers and students and other actors, social and political actors in the society. What characterizes this type of moment? In the social sciences, there have been some attempt to look at transformations. For instance, literature on democratization process, which built up also a lot on cases like the wave of democratizations in Southern Europe, Greece, and so on, have been examples of attempt by scholars to address unexpected, understructured, this is how my former supervisor, Philip Schmitter and Guglielmo O'Donnell, defined the moment of transitions to democracy, understructured, open-ended, and moment in which old ways of behaving are no longer sustained and sustainable. So we have in this period, autumn 2019, protest in Lebanon, protest in Chile, protest in Hong Kong, protest in Barcelona. Not just protest, millions march. It's been something that has been recalled very often in the mass media. And this moment has some characteristics. This type of protests are massive. They involve new groups of the populations. First of all, they involve new generations of activists. They are introducing some innovations in the forms of organizations. They developed very quickly, and they developed unexpectedly, often on the basis of what was considered to be a small triggering event. And they, of course, involved also pre-existing organizations, but they are also characterized by a lot of fluid, very informal, and very dynamic type of interactions. They moved very quickly from specific type of concerns into high level of politizations and escalations of demands, from the withdrawal of increase in taxes or in transportation fees into demands for broader and deepening of democracy and more social justice and the contestation of capitalism altogether. There have been movements that have adopted what has been called civil disobedience, but very disruptive forms of actions oriented to disrupt, in particular, the main to act at the main weakness of the system, blocking transports, blocking traffic in several areas in order to make voice loud. And they've been repressed very heavily, so that in many of these countries, more or less democratic institutions have used very high level of repression. What is the characteristics of these movements that I want to address, reflecting on this moment as moment of change and moments of challenges? I want to do so in the first part of the presentation, and then I want to move in more general reflections of which times are we living in. And this is the reasons why I used the term momentum, because I think that these are times, particular times in which events are particularly relevant. And this is what I'm going to argue. Start from a spontaneous spark and develop into challenges that could be successful in producing big changes, could be they will be repressed, but for sure they have a strong impact and a long-lasting impact. So I will ask myself and try to give an answer about which concepts we have to address these challenging times and times of transformations. These were, oops, what did I do? Yes. These were, of course, not the only moment. I mentioned the anti-austerity protest. And also in the case of the anti-austerity protest, 2011 in the Arab Spring, in Spain, in Greece, in Zuccotti parks, but also other movements, Gezi parks in Turkey, and so on. Les Nuits Debout in France, what we saw were movements that developed out of a spark that I will suggest vibrated into producing a broad type of consensus, broad waves of contestations, and that then sedimented in some sort of change. So why momentum? In Newtonian mechanics, momentum is defined as the product of mass and velocity of an object. In research on political activism, we find recently, at least since I started to think in terms of momentum, I've found many instances of movements that have used this term in order to stress the property of an act that dares to challenge existing structures through massive support and at great velocity. So it means actions that is not constrained by the environment, but challenge the structures. And to a certain extent, it brings us back to some conceptions of social movements as carriers of emergent norms that have described also this disruptive capacity of movements. So all the approaches to collective behavior stress the fact that social movements describe phenomena in which collectively transcend, bypass, subvert, establish institutional patterns and structures. And in more recent times, scholars have pointed at the contentious and potentially subversive practices that, for instance, brought about, in the case Weisinger analyzed, the breakdown of the Soviet Union. How does it happen that systems that seems to be very stable suddenly entered in these forms of turbulence? And I don't want to challenge all established knowledge about social movements. Political opportunities count, resources are important, resonant frames are helpful, but I think that we need to add some elements in our explanations when we look at protest as critical junctures moment. So a protest in moment in which neo-institutional approach to the social sciences would say change doesn't happen in a slow motion, but it happens fast. It's not incremental, but it's aiming to produce dramatic changes. And I think that we can look at this moment by distinguishing three steps in these social movements contribute to this particular form of change. I call it cracking, vibrating, and sedimenting Cracking is the production of sudden forms of rupture. Vibrating is the contingent reproductions of these ruptures in broader groups of the societies. And sedimenting is the stabilizations of the legacies of the ruptures. And I want to go quickly along these three different moments, because I think that many of the events that I defined in used as illustrations in the beginning can be understood by looking at the effects they produce in this different moment. So in many of my research, in particular research on transition to democracy, but also in the movements of 2011, an element which is stressed is the fact that sometimes events surprise not only the authorities, not only the institutions, not only the organizers, but also the scholars that are not prepared to these big changes that tend to remain within static visions for which some type of context is not favorable to change. This is citations from an interview with an activist in Egypt that says nobody was prepared, even those who thought this may be a revolution. The 25th of January, Tahrir, turned out to be much bigger than anybody thought. The 28th was the day of the revolutions, when everything changed. We know in Egypt not everything changed. There was a backlash and so on. But there have been moments like this in which cracks produce transformations that are not expected, that build upon the first moment. So we have some instruments, some toolkit to analyze this moment. They are critical junctures in neo-institutional literature, which point at the role of polarizing events that produce intense political reactions and counter-reactions. And in the old school of collective behavior, we have reflections on excitement and a type of restlessness that's developed in this moment. We have reflections by sociologists like Robin Wagner-Pacifici on the role of events. She has written books devoted to when do we talk of an event, how do we recognize an event, and which effect events have on structures. So what is the situations when occurrences set off a series of actions that only gradually and with difficulty cohere into an event, but then acquire a sort of life of their own. Historians like William Sewell have reflected on eventful temporality. So a time in which rather than events being constrained by the structures, events challenge structures, challenge relations, are able to transform the political opportunities and are able to produce resources. People is not going to this type of demonstration thinking we have to invest our precious time and resources, but they go with enthusiasm, they go with passions. So our passions is created and our passions developed is part of the understanding of events that act as breaking point, transforming the resources, transforming relations, and so on. It is what I also in other research have called eventful protests. So all protests are also producing relations, are producing interactions, are producing sense of empowerment. Some protest more than others because the convergence of what I define momentum, so mass and velocity, is producing change at a fast written. It happens through causal mechanism, emotional mechanism of excitement and surprise, cognitive mechanisms of liberation and considerations of the times as particularly exceptional, and relational mechanisms of intensified actions. But I think that what we see is also that momentum is created when the cracks reverberate, when the crack vibrates, producing also a moment of encounters. So it is not just spontaneous, or it is not the encounters of individuals, but it is, like I stress in this citation from an activist of Les Nuits Debout in France, it is the gathering on the public space. And in fact, what we see often is people marching, but when we study them, we see also people encountering, talking, organizing events, meeting, and producing knowledge, producing ideas. So I think that for the vibration, it is important that to take into account that protest is not only a moment in the street, but it is also reproduced. So I think it's good. It's useful to think about vibrations because in order for protest to acquire momentum after an initial crack, we need a combination of mass and velocity to be reproduced in an intensifications of the number of events. And this happens through the encounters in physical or virtual space. In this sense, I think it is interesting to combine reflections in social movement studies with reflections in other areas of the political and social sciences. Some of these cracks produce open-ended events. Critical junctures open up the range of plausible choices available to powerful political actors, expanding the range of what is considered to be possible. As O'Donnell and Smith mentioned, transitions from authoritarian rules is undetermined social change of large-scale transformations which occur when there are insufficient structural or behavioral parameters to guide and predict the outcome. And to return to neo-institutional approach, it is a moment in which the range of plausible choices are, as I mentioned, available. Empower the actors by producing the impressions of being able to change the structures. This is also related with something that social movement scholars have stressed in the past, is the capacity of actors to produce new norms in actions. So what makes times unsettled or restless is the capacity of developing new norms, is the reproduction of the crack through a fluidifications of existing relations and the creations of new one. So the examples that I studied is eventual forms of democratizations in which contingency and agencies tend to interact. The element of innovations are related to the emerging of new identities, emergence of new preferences, interest, a shift in the interest of the involved actors, the existence of a lack of routine. So in my own research on democratizations processes, what several of the main actors that triggered the process said, we were in a situations in which old norms, old expectations no longer holds, and we were in a situations in which new norms were emerging. In the recent forms of protest, what has been pointed at is the fact that protest opens up spaces of becoming, spaces in which actors encounter each other, new identities are built, in actions, relationships are created. The very need for actions creates a new type of structures. And the final point is in this, when and after the vibrations happens, you have then sedimentation. As I'm going to say, the neo-institutional type of approach points at the importance of the legacies of this moment. We studied memories, and we studied ways in which previous forms of protest, previous eventful moment of protest have an impact in terms not only of creating norms, but also of creating symbols to which people refer to. One of these research included Greece in 2011, was a comparative analysis of the four main largest Southern European countries, Portugal, Spain, Italy, and Greece, during the anti-austerity protest. And what we noticed was that the memories of the transitions to democracy, which was in the mid-70s in 3 of these countries, but was in the mid-40s in Italy, still played a role in the protest that happens so many decades after. For instance, as far as the Greek case was concerned, the experience of the Polytechnic rebellion is always an element that is recalled during the protest, and it is recalled in order to make reference to the influence of learning from past events, but also the empowering effect of moment of transformation. So the places, the spaces, the symbols, the songs, the slogans of the past tend to re-emerge. And in this way, norms are creating. Eventful protest often, more when they succeed, but even when they fail, tend to remain as a sort of repertoire of actions, as an examples that people reflect upon, and that's it's empowering in new wave of protest. Literature on neo-institutionalism talks of legacies as an enduring, self-perpetuating institutional inheritance of the critical junctures, of the moment of transformation. All scholars of social movements point at the cultural drift that a moment of eventful protest tend to produce. So we have, starting with the break, then a moment of resilience, of sedimentation, as I mentioned. And memory is particularly important in this. Charles Tilly mentioned that once a process, for example, a revolution, has occurred and acquired a name, both the name and the one or more representations of the process become available as signal, models, threats, and or aspirations for later actions. So the past and also the dramatic past, which is related with moment of social movements, tend to re-emerge in this new wave of eventful protest. And considering this helps us to understand how movements, to understand movements and to understand times of changes. And since Socrates told me that I have only 10 minutes left, but I think I'm on time. I just wanted to finish up with some reflections of what does it tell us in terms of general challenges that this conference is focused upon, and times of transformations that this conference is going to address. So I think that it is not just because I was reflecting on the idea of a momentous approach that I found in the literature several instances of authors reflecting on these times or on similar times to this one in terms of breaking points. Rancière talked of momentous times as the political times. So politics exist, he wrote, talking about 1968, as a deviation from the normal order of things. It's an anomaly, he says. So it's a moment in which the traditional categories through which people understand what's happening around themselves and act are no longer strong enough to lead behaviors. This is what also Philip Schmitter and O'Donnell pointed at. Times in which behavioral structures are challenged. So forms in which, moments in which anomalies push us also towards true politics as attempt to understand and intervene on structures that are no longer able to constrain our thinking and behaviors. As mentioned, one concept that is available in political science and sociology that has been very influential, the notions of a critical junctures. I think is also a notion that has been triggered by a confrontation with events and times in which the traditional visions of neo-institutional approach based on path dependencies and legacies of the past was no longer working. It was similar in history. The need of Bill Sewell, for instance, to introduce the element of eventful time was related with the fact that the longue durée of Brodel's type of approach were useful to understand some events, but were not useful to understand moments of transformations. And so critical junctures as episodes of institutional innovations that happens in a distinctive way and produce and generate enduring legacy is, I think, an important contributions to understand our time. This continued political change, David and Ruth Collier said, in which critical junctures dislodge older institutional patterns. There are moments of crisis. Ken Roberts, studying transformations in Latin America, has defined critical junctures as period of crisis or strain that in which existing policies and institutions are ill-suited to resolve. So moment in which the perception is that existing structures are not able to address changing circumstances. And I think it's also useful to reflect about this moment, as Mark Basinger did, as what he called thickened history. He wrote, "Not all historical eras are alike. There are times when change occurs so slowly that time seems also almost frozen. Though beneath the surface considerable turbulence and evolution may be silently at work. There are," he wrote, "other times when change is so compressed, blaring and fundamental that it is almost impossible to take its measures. So the constraining parameters of political undergo fundamental challenges, leading to rapidly shifting assumptions about the limits of the possible. These are time that have been defined as particularly political. These are times that have been defined as open in a Gramscian way to very different type of evolutions, from the most dramatic to the most positive. And I think that it is very interesting that the conference is going to address transformations and challenges. So thank you very much for the time you gave me. And again, thank you very much for the honor you gave me. Thank you to the University of Peloponnesus, and thank you to the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and to the School of Political and Social Sciences. And thank you very much.